Bob Murphy Show, episode 155.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Bob Murphy Show. My guest today is going to be Chris Coyne, who's professor of economics at George Mason University and the associate director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. He's also a co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics and the Independent Review, and he serves as the book review editor for the journal Public Choice. So we're going to be talking mostly about Chris's latest two books, focusing on war economics and then how the warfare state brings tyranny back home domestically. Along the way, we also just talk a lot about Austrian economics and the applications to these topics. So without further ado, here is my interview with Chris Coyne. Well, Chris, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thanks, Bob. It's great to be here, and it's good to see you again.
Nice seeing you. So for those who are watching on the YouTube version of this, they can see it looks like there's a brick background behind you. Now, is this just a studio production, or is that actually brick?
No, it's a studio production for events like this. I figure it's better than what's behind it, which is late 1970, early 1980 accordion closet door. So,
yeah, I know. So I still have the in this rental house that we're in. I've been, since the pandemic, I've been recording from here. At some point, folks, I will get a cool skyline or something, and you'll think that I'm broadcasting from downtown. So. Can you give us just I'm sure plenty of my listeners, have heard your name. They know you're, let me ask you this. Do you call yourself an Austrian economist, or are you just interested in it and respect it, but you don't use labels? And it's not, I'm wondering, I don't know.
No, of course. I certainly do.
Okay.
I certainly identify with that label, and I have for a long time, since I first got interested in economics and started to consider myself, someone who studied economics seriously. I've identified with Austrian economics. I mean, I'm an economist by training, just like you are.
Right.
But certainly in terms of schools of thought, I most closely identify with the Austrians.
Now, do you remember what it was specifically? Because I'm just curious, as people take different paths, and what was it, that you realized, it's not just that I like economics, but this Austrian school is the particular variant.
Certainly. So it all happened very quickly, and really, I was a undergraduate student at Manhattan College in New York City, and I was studying economics, and I was kind of indifferent to it. I didn't love it or hate it. I was just kind of going through the motions. I also was studying finance, which is what I wanted to work in. And I did work in finance for several years before going back to graduate school. But my junior year, so my third year of school, I had Peter Boettke. Peter Boettke left NYU, came to Manhattan College for a year before he went to back to Mason,
right,
where he has remained since. And so I just happened to take two elective classes with him, comparative economic systems and public economics. And in comparative, we were introduced to Mises and Hayek and the calculation debate and that history. And in public economics, we were introduced to James Buchanan, Gordon Tullock. I had no insight into any of these thinkers beyond what I was learning at the time. But both of them really opened my eyes to seeing the world in a way I hadn't seen it, understanding it. Pete left after that year. I just kept reading, these thinkers on my own. A lot of people get into Austrian economics through libertarianism. I didn't. I actually started by reading Mises and Hayek, and not, for instance, Mises' liberalism. But some of his pure economic works. And then only after that, I Googled around. I found the Mises Institute, which was a very kind of early mover at that time, because we're talking here in the late 90s. They were an early mover with posting a lot of content on the web.
Right.
So there I got exposed to Murray Rothbard and so on. So started reading all that and a bunch of other Austrian thinkers, certainly more contemporary thinkers as well. and just kept reading on my own. So a lot of my education pre-graduate school in economics was really kind of self-taught, and a lot of reading, going to lectures in New York City and so on. And that's kind of how I got into it. And then when I decided to go back to graduate school, Mason was the only place I applied to. I knew I wanted to work with Pete and study Austrian economics. And so it's kind of the history in brief.
Okay. For the benefit, I've had a few people on maybe who've talked about it, but can you just give us the quick version of, I know a lot of my listeners, they know the Austrian stuff, they know Rothbard, they have heard of Buchanan and Tulloch, but they haven't read much of it. And so what's, for someone who's like, I'm an Austrian, what else do I need to know? Like, why should they become more aware of like what does the public choice school bring to the table that the Austrian canon, you wouldn't have realized without?
Certainly. That's a wonderful question. And there's different views on Buchanan and Tulloch by those in Austrian economics, and that's all fine. With a lot of this stuff, I always try to look for areas of complementarity and kind of value added. And I do think there's a lot of value added. But if I had to kind of distill down a very broad body of work, it would really be this idea of symmetry of assumptions. Symmetry of assumptions. Mm-hmm. So we assume that actors in markets, in market settings, are purposeful actors, as Mises taught us. They have goals that they seek to achieve. For a long period of time, and still today, but to a lesser degree, economists assumed that when we talked about politics or when we talked about people in politics, they were somehow acting in the public interest. So, the standard kind of welfare economic story is you have some social welfare function that is known to the state, and then the state takes steps to maximize that welfare. They correct market failures and so on. Really, what Buchanan early on in the 40s emphasized was that we have to take this box that people are calling the state and unpack it. And we can't just assume that it's kind of this supercomputer that has access to both the social welfare function and the ability or the desire, that is the incentive to maximize that social welfare function. And so what does it entail to unpack that box, the state? Well, we need to look at both the incentives that constitute the various layers of the state, which are, of course, are very complex, and also the epistemic properties, the knowledge properties. And that's where I think the connection between, or one connection between Buchanan and the Austrians is quite clear, which is this emphasis on there's no way for someone in a state or an analyst, even the most well-trained, smartest economists, to access the preferences of human beings when we take those preferences as being subjective in the mind of the actor and somehow aggregate them into some kind of welfare function that can be acted upon by the state. And if you read Buchanan, and especially in the 40s, 50s, and even to the 60s, and then you read Murray Rothbard, for instance, on welfare economics and his work on a reconstruction of welfare economics, there's a lot of similarities in terms of an appreciation for the subjectivism of utility on the part of the individual actor, the fact that subjectivism means that opportunity cost is not number one, not objective, but number two, never acted upon because it's in the mind of the actor. So as an external observer, you can never know what that cost is because it's never acted upon. And that has some radical implications for the way we think about welfare economics and policy. If people are interested in this and they said, well, what can I read more? Of course, you can read Buchanan. Thomas DiLorenzo has a wonderful paper in the Review of Austrian Economics. I think this is when Murray Rothbard was editing the journal. And it's called something like The Subjectivist Foundations of James Buchanan's Constitutional Political Economy. Mm-hmm. So I'm not getting it exactly right, but it's something like that. And he talks about several of the points I just raised, Buchanan's work in his book Cost and Choice, which is a radically subjective notion of opportunity cost, and several other points as well. And so that would be kind of a good starting point. And, Mises and Hayek really understood, although it's not the kind of emphasis of their analysis of central planning, they understood many of these issues that we would call public choice issues today. They take in the initial kind of iteration, or maybe the first and second iteration of the calculation debate, they take the motivations of planners as constant. They assume benevolence on the part of the planners. And they do so not because they're naive to the world, that they actually assume people are benevolent, but they're saying, look, let me give my opponents in the debate kind of the best terms or conditions I can, and then see if they actually can succeed in achieving their stated ends. And of course, what Mises and Hayek showed was that the proposed means were not suitable to achieve those ends. But, both of them recognize, again, it's not fully developed, but both of them recognize that the other issue with all this is you are going to give a significant amount of discretionary power to a small group of people over the lives of other human beings when you give them the ability to plan economic life. And there are good reasons to believe that undesirable people are going to rise to positions of power to secure the planning power, but also to utilize it to achieve their own goals at the expense of the very people they purport to want to assist. And so when you combine these insights, I think it's quite powerful analysis. You have the kind of epistemic or calculation type argument that Mises and Hayek make, and then you have the Buchanan-Tulloch emphasis on symmetry of assumptions and incentives in politics, and it's a pretty powerful combination.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you touched on a lot of issues there. Let me just make sure the listeners got the gist of it. So when you're saying symmetry of assumptions, what you're getting at is, I think probably the best example is when it comes to standard market failure theory, where it's oh, look at all these ways that if the market deviates from the assumptions of perfect competition and these simplistic models, we wouldn't expect the equilibrium outcome to be Pareto optimal. And therefore, there's a role for the state to come in, and they just move on with their lives and don't ask, well, wait a minute. Yes, global climate change. Let's say that's a thing, and that's a problem, negative externality. But why would it be in the interest of the people running the government of some tiny little country to wreck their economy for the benefit of the mass of humanity 50 years from now? That doesn't make any sense either. You know what I mean? In other words, if a corporate CEO goes ahead and burns fossil fuels because, it's not in his immediate self-interest, why wouldn't he? By the same token, then why would you assume the governments of the world are going to get together and solve the problem? So is that what you're getting at with the symmetry of assumptions? Yeah.
It's that people are not transformed from when they move from the private setting, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, to the political setting. It's not, if John Corzine, when he was CEO of Goldman Sachs, I'm from New Jersey and New York, so, John Corzine was the CEO of Goldman Sachs before he was a politician in New Jersey. If you say, well, when he's CEO of Goldman Sachs, he is selfish, greedy, and so on. It's not when he gets elected to office that all of a sudden he transforms into an angel. Calling him a public servant or a civil servant doesn't change his nature. He's still John Corzine. He has purposes and plans. He is shaped by the incentives and the features of the environment he's in, which varies. Certainly a for-profit firm is different than politics. But that's kind of the assumption. Rather than saying, as you pointed out, markets do stuff. People in markets do things that generates market failures. Government fixes those. Well, what's the government? Who is the government? What information and knowledge do they have, and what is needed to achieve the stated claim? Not made by proponents of markets, but by proponents of government fixing markets and market failure.
And then another thing you said there, I remember. So what is it like? Was it called the LSE Essays on Cost or something? Is that a collection? So that wasn't all Buchanan, right? It was was Buchanan one in there among other?
Yep, that's right.
Okay,
so one essay. It's a collection of essays.
Right. So I remember, that one. So by the way, folks, so this is bobmurphyshow.com/155, where I'll put links to the things that I can find that are up for free. And I remember, the Buchanan making that point. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing, but saying cost is never realized. It's always ex ante, or it's always anticipated.
Exactly.
And that kind of blew my mind so can you just spell that out? What does Buchanan mean when he's saying cost is always something in the future? You never realize, what was the cost of that decision?
Sure. So he differentiates kind of between forward-looking and backward-looking costs, which is really what you're getting at. At the moment of action, we are always anticipating, because we live, as Mises said. This is why I think there's a tight connection. Even though, I'm not saying Buchanan and Mises and Hayek and Tulloch. It's not that they're all carbon copies of each other, by the way. There's many areas where they disagree. But on this topic, I think, again, there's some nice complementarity, which is when human beings act, as Mises said, the kind of prerequisites of action, we live in a world of uncertainty. You have to be able to envision a preferable state of affairs. You have to believe in causality, that you think that you can kind of marshal the means to bring about that preferable state of affairs. Well, that's all requires anticipation and envisioning a future state of the world. That's all in the mind of the actor. The opportunity cost, the trade-off, the next best alternative is in your mind. It is something that you are perceiving an opportunity or a potential cost of action, I should say. And you say, I could do that, or I could do something else. And then you choose to do something. The foregone alternative, the opportunity cost, which you weighed at the moment of action, is never acted upon. It is foregone by definition. And so it's not an objective thing. It's both perceived by the actor through the lens of their mind. That's the subjective part, meaning that the way you perceive a cost is not the way I will perceive it, and so on. And it's never observable to other people because it's never acted upon in a concrete way. And this is why Rothbard talks about demonstrated preference. As economists, we focus on what is demonstrated through concrete action because we can't talk about other things because we don't have access to them. And it's a similar type of point. And so that raises a host of interesting insights, one of them being that there's no way to, even for an individual actor to kind of get access to the way they rank all states of the world so that I can make judgments then about, whether they've made a good or bad trade-off or movements I can make to improve their welfare. Then we move from the individual to society, a group of people. There's no way to add anything up, to aggregate up. And there's social choice theorists. They're kind of worried about the logistics and operationalizing, adding stuff up. But this point is even more fundamental. Like, can you actually, is there stuff to add up? The Buchanan point is that there's a big chunk of things missing that you can't add up. And those things are really important, which are subjective evaluations. And this isn't just some esoteric point. It has practical implications today. You brought up externalities. Another area where this is crucial is public goods. And most kind of standard treatments of public goods is, okay, something has public good aspects in the Samuelsonian sense, Paul Samuelson, so it's non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Therefore, severely underprovided on the market, state has to provide it. And then you kind of move on. And often these are enormous issues, if you think about it. So the textbook example is national defense. Mm-hmm. And so I with a student a couple of years ago, I had them look through the top principles of micro, intermediate micro, and public finance textbooks for public goods. And national defense is the example in like 97% of books. But it's like 2 paragraphs. But then that leaves a whole host of important issues untouched, which is, well, what constitutes defense? How do people know this? How do they provide it? What's the marginal unit of defense? How do they know how to stop? As Rothbard once said, goods don't fall from on high in prepackaged bundles. Mm-hmm. People have to make decisions about marginal units, both in terms of the amount, but in terms of quantity as well. And so, just saying something is a public good and then saying, well, the state can provide it, doesn't solve any of the economic issues. It just raises a whole host of issues. And so from that standpoint, these insights, I think, are still relevant today.
Okay, well, that's great. So why don't we go into then 2 of your recent books, talking about defense. That'll come up in a minute, I suppose. But the one, let's see, let me pull up the exact title here. So the first one I want to talk about is your book that came out in 2018 with, that was co-authored, right? Yeah, with Abigail Hall.
Okay. Abigail Hall, yep.
Okay, and so the title here is Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism. So can you give us a quick overview of that, and then we'll dive in? Certainly.
And so the core argument in that book that Abby and I make is that when a society, or more specifically the government that supposedly governs over a society in the interest of citizens, adopts a proactive militaristic foreign policy, it has real effects on domestic life. And so again, a lot of this discussion comes out of the points you and I were just discussing, which mm-hmm. is the way economists talk about defense is it's kind of this entity that is provided by the state. It's always value added. It is always for the good. Again, in economics, good has a very specific meaning, which, people want it. They want more as compared to less, holding all else constant. Right. But what if things that fall under the purview of state-provided defense actually generate bads for the people that are supposedly served by the state? That's kind of the motivating question we ask. And so, we talk about how this might happen. And at the core of our argument is what we call the boomerang effect. And a well-thrown boomerang, when you throw it, it comes back to the person who throws it, if you throw it properly. And so the argument is that foreign interventions, both preparing for them and engaging in them, often boomerangs back and comes back to the country that is intervening abroad or preparing to intervene abroad and undermines domestic liberties and freedoms. And to provide a very high level of how this might operate, you think about what is entailed in both preparing for and engaging in foreign interventions. And really, the state invests a significant amount of resources in developing tools, techniques, and methods to control other human beings, to intervene. The reason you intervene in another society is because you don't like the status quo. If you like the status quo, there'd be no urge to intervene. And so you want to get change. So how do you get change? Well, you can ask people. You can say, please behave differently. And they might voluntarily comply. But if they don't, you can either leave or you can backstop your demands with force or the threat thereof. And so foreign interventions at their core require the existence of an apparatus of controlling other human beings. And then what does that involve? Well, it involves the state redirecting monetary resources and human capital to developing these techniques, to developing ways of controlling people. And just like entrepreneurship works in markets and improves human welfare by coming up with new low-cost ways of satiating consumer wants, so too do government interventions come up with new ways of controlling other people, which in many cases are harmful, and not just to the people that they're targeted against. And so, to provide kind of a concrete example, if you study the surveillance state, which of course came to light with the revelations by Edward Snowden in 2013, you realize precisely this point that I just made, that this is by no means the first time that the US government has used widespread massive surveillance on people living domestically and internationally. It's that the technological innovations that are now available have allowed the government to do so in a more effective and efficient and covert manner. And looking at kind of normal fiscal measures like amount spent on military expenditures in the aggregate or per capita or however people want to cut those kind of aggregate figures, it's irrelevant for the broader point I want to make, misses these nuances. In fact, you can make the argument that you could have a falling budget and still have more state involvement and control because of innovation. I can now do more things with technology than I could before using fewer resources. Drones can do things that fighter jets could do at a much cheaper cost. And so, a lot of the discussion of aggregates, so when economists even focus on things like defense, they typically say, well, let's look at spending or spending per capita. But you need to unpack that. You need to see how it is being spent. It's not just the scale of the state, but also the scope or the range of activities that are being undertaken. And so we apply this logic to a couple different topics, surveillance, militarization of police, and a few others, to understand using the tools of economics and political economy, the interplay between politics and economics, how efforts that are undertaken in the name of protecting the public interest, the national security, actually undermine those very things.
Okay, great. So some of this will just be redundant, but I just want to make sure we pull this out. So, for example, making arguments along the lines of, it's ominous when we see how they're using drones and surveilling people in Afghanistan and on the basis, they didn't go to get a judge's order. They just got some intelligence and they go and they, take out this party of people because they claim they were that besides, in the abstract being concerned about another human being over in Afghanistan possibly getting blown up, even if they didn't do anything wrong. The blowback of don't kid yourself, 20 years from now, that's how a tyrannical state is going to monitor people, look for dissidents in the United States who are like posting stuff on pirate web stations or whatever that, is against the state's line. And so, even if you don't care about foreigners, don't kid yourself, that's coming back home. Is that a part of what you're getting at?
Yeah, and of course, that's exactly right. And while the time frame varies. You said 20 years, and certainly that's the case. But it's oftentimes much faster. I mean, drones are used domestically for surveillance now. Within the United States, and as well as other technologies that were developed abroad. So in some sense, it's like really quick.
Right. Well, in fairness, though, I mean, when they first started doing the drones, it wasn't yesterday in the Middle East.
No,
you know what I'm saying? So
yeah.
the time frame of when it was first introduced, and people are like, "Hey, should we be using drones over there?" And be like, "Oh, what are you crying crocodile tears for Osama bin Laden?" And
no, you're right. And this is interesting because one of the common attacks, which isn't a new attack, people have been making it for long periods of time, kind of against what are today categorized as civil libertarians, is almost like this mocking tone, like, oh, you all think that if you have a drone over there, that somehow that's going to lead to like a despot taking over America tomorrow. And that's not so much the argument, right? Of course, that's possible, but the argument is kind of rather this slow burn argument. What Alexis de Tocqueville in his book Democracy in America, he differentiated between what he called hard despotism and soft despotism. Hard despotism is when the despot takes over, and it's very observable. But soft despotism is this kind of slow erosion of liberties and freedoms as the scope of the state expands. And in many cases, it's kind of like the frog being boiled. It's a slow boil, and they don't even realize it until they're boiled. And so that's really the concern here. And I think that's a legitimate threat. Many people don't, but I think it's the main threat to a free society.
Yeah, another example of that so I'll be even-handed and, because I'm sure most of my listeners are with us on the drone thing, but I bet there are a lot of people who favor, hey, Trump, go build that wall to keep these, the illegal immigrants out because they're going to come in and vote for bigger welfare state and blah, blah, blah. And the thing I say to them is, even putting that stuff aside, if we all agree that the danger is 20 years from now, it's truly a dystopian, prison USA state, they're going to need to have big walls around to keep people in. And so even if they build it right now for your purposes, who's to stop? You know what I mean? So it's the same kind of arguments. Right. Like when they make fun of progressives, like, oh, let me get this straight. You want the government to take over healthcare and you think that we just elected Hitler. Like that doesn't go together, folks. You know what I mean? And they can't believe their dumb lefty friends. You're so committed to getting your free health care, you don't see the danger. It's like, okay, you're so committed to keeping out illegal immigrants, you don't see the danger of letting them build a wall on the border. So
that's an important point. Yeah, that symmetry that you're making is a very important one.
Okay, so let me ask you, and maybe the answer is it's both, but in terms of the militarization of the police. So what you're having in mind, things like, what do they call those things? Like armored personnel carriers, like these big, they're not tanks, but they're bigger than SUVs and they're harder than SUV, so these things that you see. And so a lot of that is like what surplus military, it comes home and then they either give it or sell it at really cheap prices. So your local police now all of a sudden have this thing where, oh yeah, if there's a drug house, we just roll in with this thing and, and they pose and they look like they're real badasses and stuff.
Yep. So
is that how much of that is that the local police want that stuff or the government's just handing it? I guess, is it the supply or the demand or both? If you get what I'm trying to get at?
Yes. So it's a combination. It's largely though on the, if I had to choose, I think the supply side, so the demand, so the supply's there by the government. I can talk more about that in a moment, but the demand comes from the local police or local subunits, and that's the driver of this because in most cases, they have to apply through these programs to get it. So if they don't do it, it's not like the federal government just comes in and drops this stuff down on them, even though that surplus is in there. And you have to understand that one of the unique features of all this is the scope of the battlefield. And so for many wars in human history or in American history, not all, of course, but certainly, if you think 1900s, during the 1900s, wars were kind of over there. You sent troops over there and then they came back after the war ended. Well, one of the unique features of kind of the more recent wars, and what I'm talking about is the war on drugs and the war on terror, which are unique wars unto themselves, but they cover the entire globe. There's no area that does not fall under the purview of the war on drugs and the war on terror. Mm-hmm. And part of the problem with that is that, that means that the state or states have the ability to go everywhere because the battlefield is everywhere. And so that also means that everyone is a potential suspect, a potential combatant, because there's not people wearing uniforms over there that's easily divisible. All right. So, the militarization of police, we talk about this now, but it really started, in the 80s. It started in the 80s under Reagan. Reagan was a key driver because of the war on drugs. And, people have to understand the economics of prohibition, and there's been work done on this. Mark Thornton's an expert on this and wrote a wonderful book on the economics of prohibition, in addition to numerous articles. But, the gist of that is when you make something illegal, it has certain economic effects. It drives it underground. It doesn't go away. It drives underground. It attracts high time preference people, high risk people that are willing to engage in illegal behaviors. It leads to the replacement of peaceful means of dispute resolution with violence. You can't call the police or take someone to court or hire a private arbitrator, at least one that acts legally, if you're engaged in illegal behavior. So you rely on violence. That then requires weaponry. And so what happened is you get the war on drugs, you get the logical kind of outcomes of the economics of prohibition. And so what you had is, drug gangs and cartels with weaponry and police with like a small pistol. And of course, they would say, we're outmanned here. We need guns. We need weapons. So in 1981, you get the Military Cooperation and Law Enforcement Act. And that was the first kind of step where the Department of Defense could both share information and equipment and advice with local police departments who wanted it. And then this program went through various iterations through the 90s. Now there's something called the 1033 program and the 1122 program, if you ever hear of those. And those are the programs where local police departments can apply for surplus equipment. And some of this is more mundane equipment, by the way. It's like, a night vision goggles or, like jackets and stuff like that. But others are kind of the MRAPs that you were talking about, weapons, surveillance equipment, and so on. And it's not just the weapons that I think is problematic, but also just the nature of it. The policing's always had a very kind of high variance existence between. What I mean by that is, it's always meant to be to like protect people, but it's always been abused by people. Policing, the policing functions of the state, both by those in the state and by people connected to the state. But the purpose of it, even if it's an idealistic purpose, is to protect people and their property. That's at least the idea, to serve and protect. Right? We see that written on police cars. And that kind of framing changes when you take on kind of the mentality of a soldier. A soldier's goal, when you send a soldier into combat, you say, well, what are they doing? You don't say to serve and protect. Right. They're there to kill or to neutralize an enemy. And that's a very different way of thinking about things. And so, you can see why that's problematic and for a free society and why it's troublesome.
So let's see. Can you talk about how much of it is, I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this. Is it that there is this cabal of people behind the scenes and they want to have, the federal government get much more powerful and they realize, oh, this is partly the way to get to the police state? Is this stuff, or is it more just, do you think it's more decentralized and there's no one in charge of this, but this is the direction that the whole system is going, and you're just, you and Abigail are like, hey everyone, look, do you see these trends? Let's turn this around. Or are there people like twirling their mustaches and being like, they're onto us, but don't worry, it's too late to stop us?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of those things, but let me just clarify. In other words, I don't think it's just one or the other, and I think which one of those or potentially other factors are kind of driving this or context specific. I don't think there's a cabal of people sitting in a dark room that's saying, I want to give an MRAP to the police department in, pick some small town in Illinois or something like that. And I think that's the way to kind of impose the police state. I do think at the national level, I do believe there is something called or what is often referred to as the deep state. Mm-hmm. Again, a lot of people like that's a conspiracy theory. Well, just step back for a moment. There are unelected people in political institutions. I think that's not a controversial fact. There's people that are elected, and then they either appoint people or hire them, and then they outsource things to both private contractors or they appoint other bureaucrats. So they are non-elected political officials, and those non-elected political officials often have significant sway over policy. Do they have complete control to do whatever they want? Of course not. Is there zero oversight? Of course not. Is there significant slack in the national security state for people to do things outside the purview of either congressional oversight or certainly the oversight of citizens? Certainly. Mm-hmm. We know this. Again, if you question this, just go look at the Snowden revelations. And if you think that's a one-off, go look at the Church Committee in the 70s, which is really like the Snowden revelations, but with with weaker technologies, because the fancier technologies didn't exist yet in the 70s. And so, we don't even need to use the term deep state if people find that problematic. I understand what it means. I like it because I think it captures something. But think about this: appointed people, special interest groups. If you understand the logic of those two concepts and purposeful behavior, the fact that people act purposely to achieve their goals, if you understand those concepts and kind of tie them together, it's no different than thinking it's a conspiracy if I said there's farmers who actively lobby for subsidies for the products they produce. If someone came and said, well, that's a conspiracy. No, it's not. It's kind of the logical outcome of creating profits or what economists call rents associated with politics, and people are going to come out of the woodwork to try to get those rents. And it's the same thing in national security. And then at local police departments, again, I'm sure some of them are, or many of them, I don't know. I think it depends. I haven't done some kind of systematic study. I'm sure they truly believe they want to help people. I'm sure a lot of them think having state-of-the-art equipment helps them do that. I think other people are good bureaucrats, and good bureaucrats, because they can't rely on profit and loss, have to do other things to signal that they are being effective. And one of the things you can do to signal that you're being effective is produce observable stuff. I can have a parade where I roll my MRAP down the street and show people locally that, look, I secured this for my constituents at zero cost or minimal cost because the federal government gave it to me. Or they can say that they're tough on crime. Right? A very easy winning political argument is to say, I'm tough on crime and my opponent's not. Certainly today in America, that's a very easy kind of, no one would say, no, I like crime. I'm not tough on crime. And so how do you signal that? Well, you get lots of stuff that signals that you're taking steps to fight crime. So I think it's those factors together that creates these things, again, combined with a whole host of other issues. The journalist Radley Balco, who's done a lot of work on the militarization of police, he one of the kind of the key points that he emphasizes is the rise of no-knock raids. No-knock raids, again, it's associated with the war on drugs, and you can understand the logic behind them.
Hey, Chris, most people probably know what that means, but in case there are some, I keep hearing that phrase. What does that mean, a no-knock raid?
Okay, a no-knock raid is, think about this. What is the concern in the war on drugs? You let's say you have good intelligence for a drug dealer or a drug producer, and you knock on their door and you announce yourself. Right? You have a warrant. You say, police, please open up. What's the concern? They're going to run and destroy the stuff. They're going to flush it down the toilet. They're going to try to get rid of the evidence. So the idea behind a no-knock raid was that, you get the warrant to go to enter someone's property, and you don't need to announce yourself before going in. I can literally kick the door in, or the windows, or both, come in and do what I want to do. And typically, you can look this up, there's video of it on YouTube. There's tons of articles on it from a variety of scholarly and popular sources. Typically when they go in with heavy artillery. And again, their justification is that we don't want to get killed by the drug dealers. And you say, okay, this might work very well if you had perfect information about the drug dealers, where they are, what they're doing, and so on, and you avoid human error. But there are numerous cases, and again, Radley Balco's done a wonderful job documenting them, of even, very mundane errors. All of us have gone to someone's house and gone up to the wrong door by mistake. We just get the number wrong. We read the number wrong, whatever. We're human beings. Now imagine doing that, but kicking in someone's door, and you see movement and you start shooting at people. Or, as Abigail and I talk about in the book when we start this chapter, of a case where police kicked in a door threw smoke grenades and it went into the crib of a child that was sleeping and basically burnt their face and it had burns all over their body. And so then you have to ask yourself, what's the cost of these things? Because, of course, people will push back and say, no, this is a relatively small number, right? So it's not a big deal. Well, certainly the people that are the innocent people that are killed, maimed, and so on, don't think it's a small number. But also, even from the perspective of officers, the people in the policing, it seems odd to put them in danger's way, which is really what you're doing. Because when people are surprised by someone entering their home, oftentimes they'll shoot. And the other kind of concern with this is that typically officers have immunity. And so let's say you are a law-abiding citizen in all ways, shapes, and forms, and you have a firearm legally, and someone kicks in your front door. You're sitting there on your couch with your family, someone kicks in your front door. The natural inclination is going to be to protect yourself. And I think most people would not think that is odd. So you shoot, right? And then let's say you harm the officer. You can be held liable for that. You can be held liable in a criminal court for that. Likewise, if you get shot, the officers have immunity because they were just doing their job. And you can see how these perverse incentives generate an array of outcomes which are kind of at odds with very common sense notions of liberty and freedom, all in the name of fighting this open-ended war on drugs, which is unclear what it would mean to even win that war.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And even if you weren't, to move away from the, it's purist in terms of like, suppose they really did mess up and the person wasn't a drug. But even if it is a drug dealer and they're sitting there and they've got some heavy weaponry because, there's rival gangs and stuff. And yeah, so if the police burst in or the DEA or whatever, just in a military style raid and don't announce who they are, the drug dealers might not, in other words, they might know enough to say, oh yeah, don't get in a shooting match with the DEA because that's not going to go well. But if you don't know it's 2:00 in the morning and people are breaking in, they could just think it's a rival gang, in which case, yeah, of course we're going to defend ourselves. So you're right. Like it is this, like the opening premise is, oh, it's okay to use violence to stop people from ingesting substances that we don't think are good for them. And then it leads you to some pretty bad places pretty quickly.
Yeah. And it compounds. It literally infects all areas of life because now you just do, ordinary citizens do things, go to the airport, get on a cruise. There's drug sniffing dogs. There's people stopping you. There's people questioning you. And then you have all the policing for profit where you can be stopped. And if you have too much cash as determined by the officer stopping you, they can seize those assets. And then the burden is on you
right.
to demonstrate your innocence.
Yeah,
I mean, how bizarre is that?
There's some horror stories. So I used to live in Nashville, and I think it's I-40 was like the east-west one, if I'm not getting mixed up. And so they were alleging that, that was a big drug route. And what was funny, and so they were stopping, like you said, there's horror stories, like some guy who didn't trust banks, and he was going to go buy a house. And so he was traveling with $30,000 in cash in his trunk. And they pulled him over and took his money. And yeah, it was like a year later, he still hadn't gotten his money back because he had to prove that he wasn't a drug dealer. They didn't have to prove that he was one. They just said, no, that's weird. Who drives around with that much cash in your trunk? You must be a drug dealer. And then he's got to go prove he wasn't. Like, that's crazy. But what was particularly telling is with this, and I was proud of it because I knew the person who worked for the TV station that did the story on it, is there was some local, and I don't remember what it was, but there was some local news station in Nashville that was questioning the narrative because the deal was, I think it was coming from the east into, so westbound into Nashville. That would be the people taking the drugs. Then they would get the money and go back. And the police, all their checkpoints were set up on the money side.
Right.
And it was like, well, wait a minute. If really what you're caring about is stopping the drug traffic, wouldn't you stop the drugs coming into Nashville rather than just taking the money from the drug dealers after they've made their sales? So it was funny too. Another thing you just said there was kind of an offhand remark, but you were talking about, if people don't like the term deep state, they think it's a conspiracy theory. Ironically, a lot of the people who think, the use of that phrase deep state, that's just a conspiracy, they also think that Vladimir Putin met with, members of Trump's team and did sorts of things in secret to steal the presidency. Some might call that a conspiracy theory. You know what I mean? So it's, to me, like, it's just so weird. Or like the official 9/11 report, I went and Googled this. It literally has the word either conspiracy or conspired. That like these 19 hijackers conspired. You know what I mean? So it's like, that doesn't discredit it, because everyone believes in conspiracy theories. Just for some reason in our culture now, that phrase has come to mean not just a hypothesis involving a conspiracy of a conspirator or a group of conspirators, but something that's obviously stupid and only a paranoid person could believe this. Like, for some reason.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's meant as an insult that is meant. So it's almost meant like as a stopping argument. Like, right. I'm not going to listen to what you're saying because it's crazy. That's really how it's used. It
was weird. Like, recently on NPR, I heard it had to do with that, like, QAnon stuff, which I don't even really know what that is, but they were making fun of it, and like the NPR people brought it because I think Trump retweeted something that was from QAnon or whatever, and so the NPR story, like, the whole point of the bit was they brought on like a psychologist to explain what is it that makes a person receptive to conspiracy theories. And, well, the person feels powerless and there's forces out there, and you know what I mean? Like, to just mentally diagnose everybody who might believe in something that, is, anyway, you get the point. Okay, well, why don't we then, so what is, your latest book is called Defense, Peace, and War Economics. And so I'm assuming it's compatible with the Tyranny one, but it sounds like that's a broader focus.
Yeah, and so this is it's an interesting area. This is a monograph that's part of a series that is published by Cambridge University Press, and it's called Elements in Austrian Economics. And the idea is to have these monographs, so not full-length books, but they're also longer than kind of a academic journal article that delves into a topic. And as the Austrian elements aspect implies, really emphasizes how Austrian economics matters for this, what Austrian economics contributes in kind of open areas. And so this area of defense and peace research is an area that I've been interested in for several decades now. And again, the origins of this go back to my early days reading, that I was talking about earlier, reading Austrian Economists. When Rothbard, I think it's an article called Reply to Mr. Schuller, something like that. Schuller, I might be getting the name wrong. He lays out this taxonomy of what falls under the purview of praxeology, and one of the categories is conflict. That's a relative. And Mises at the end of Human Action talks about war and total war, so he has that in there, and so on. And so I was in graduate school at George Mason, my first semester during the 9/11 attacks. And of course, some of those were not too far from Fairfax, where I was, the attack on the Pentagon.
Right.
And then, of course, you get the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And very quickly, I realized that really no one was talking about some basic things that you and I were discussing earlier, the kind of Econ 101, what are the incentives both people in the U.S. government face, but also people that are being intervened on, and people in the region and around the globe? What are their incentives? Do they align with what the U.S. government is telling us they want to accomplish? Do the members of the U.S. government actually know how to impose liberalism or liberal democracy in other societies? So that turned into my dissertation, was on that topic. And it's something I've been talking about ever since, as one of my main kind of areas of emphasis. And this monograph is an attempt to bring together a lot of those different kind of insights. And so we already talked about the tyranny aspect, or the tyranny comes home aspect. So let me just touch upon two others, and then we can talk about whatever interests you. I think that, going back to our discussion of kind of Mises and Hayek, I think there's two areas where those insights are crucial to thinking about defense and matters of defense and state provision of defense. And one is, as I mentioned, the ability of members of a government to intervene in another society and design that society according to its wishes. And so this is analogous to what Hayek toward the end of his career called the fatal conceit. He was talking about economic planning, or what he called the errors of socialism. But the fatal conceit for Hayek is the belief that people can shape the world according to their desires. I have some blueprint of how the world should look, and I can impose that. So that's the economic planning aspect, which I'll come to in a moment. But what about other aspects of life? Can you design political institutions? Can you design the economy? Can you design legal systems? Certainly, if you look at kind of the handbooks that are given to the members of the U.S. military, like the Stability Operations Manual, they believe you can. And they distill these things down into like these very neat, like 5-step dynamics, where it's like, create peace, create a viable workforce, create a capital markets, voila, sustainable liberal economy. It's like, all right, well, wait a second here. That's easier than putting together a piece of IKEA furniture. Something's amiss here.
Hey, just to make sure we get what you're saying, they have a manual for, like, if you go into a region that's lawless and chaotic and you do regime change, now how do we fix it and turn it into like the 51st state?
Yep, exactly. So it is what is called kind of what for a while the cute kind of phrase that the members of the U.S. government used was the 3 Ds: development, diplomacy, and defense. And they said you can't separate these things. So a lot of people tend to think of like diplomacy as I'm going to engage with someone, right, and talk with them and try to work through differences. And strike agreements. Then they think of development as, well, I'm going to have the development experts come in and create economic development. And then you think of defense as military-related activities. Right. And what after 9/11 especially, what they said is we can't separate these things. And so in Afghanistan, when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, this took the form of what was called government in a box. That was literally what it was called. And so what you did is you had the military come through. This was the idea, and clean out the bad people, the insurgents. Right behind them, you have the humanitarians and kind of diplomats come in, and the humanitarians kind of clean up any collateral damage that happened, help people out, give them food and water. The diplomats talk to people and tell them what's going on. And then behind them, you have the development experts come in. That's government policymakers and international organizations and economists. And then they're going to create kind of development. They're going to create economic development, and then you're going to get a self-sustaining society. That was the vision. And then, so that's kind of a meta knowledge issue. Like, can we actually design the institutions within which human interaction take place? I don't believe you can. Other people think you can with good planning and good resources. Then you kind of go to the second level of this, and that is planning within institutions. And this is where Mises and Hayek's calculation argument comes into play, which is, what is development? Well, at its core, development is not simply achieving certain outcomes as dictated by some well-trained economist or some policymaker. It is satiating the wants of people that live in a society, that live in the system, however we're defining the boundaries of that. And decisions need to be made about how to allocate and reallocate scarce resources to satiate those wants. And that economic knowledge is not given. It is not known. It has to be discovered. People have to figure it out. As Mises pointed out, that requires a certain institutional setting, property rights over the means of production, and so on down the line. And so you take these things together, and it's a powerful set of insights. Then you think domestically, and this is the last thing I'll say, you think about the actual production of defense within the United States or other country we're talking about. It is an exercise in non-comprehensive planning. Non-comprehensive planning is our efforts that take the logic of comprehensive planning, and they don't try to plan the entire economy like the original socialists wanted to do. They try to plan certain areas of it. Mm-hmm. And the entire military sector is an effort at this. And socialists realize this. Like, if you go back to the early days of the calculation debate, so I'm talking, late 1800s and the 1900s, you look at Mises, then you look at an economist by the name of Otto Neurath, who, of course, was Mises' classmate in von Bavarich's seminar. Otto Neurath made the argument that he has an article called something like From the War Economy to Economy in Kind. And what he said is, look, if you look at the war effort in Europe during World War I and even prior to that, this was amazing. Like, they took resources, they produced lots of outputs, lots of people were employed, people had money to spend. Why don't we just take that same logic and apply it to everything when the war is over? Mm-hmm. Why stop at making bombs and tanks? In fact, Neurath says justice dictates that we do that. And so the very foundations of the socialist argument for certain people was grounded in the war economy. And if you think about it, that's what it is. And people have talked about this. Robert Higgs, of course, has talked about this and done a lot of work. There's an engineer named Seymour Melman who's done work on this. And Tom Woods has written an article, I think it's in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, on Seymour Melman. A lot of people in Austrian economics circles don't necessarily know Melman's name. He wasn't an Austrian economist by any means, but he talked about how war production distorts economic activity. he doesn't invoke the Misesian type of planning argument, calculation argument, but I think there's clear connections to be had. And so you get all of these kind of constraints on both the planning side of production of defense, the use of defense, or what falls under the purview of defense, which is really offense. That's a better word for a lot of this stuff, abroad. And you can see how there are, and those are just some of the connections you can make from kind of the foundational tenets of Austrian economics to these issues of defense and peace.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Chris, because when you said the 3 Ds and one of them was defense, and what you meant was our troops going over to some other country, in this case on the basis of bogus intelligence and completely, dropping bombs and going through and smashing stuff and putting in a new government and calling that defense, It's and I know probably most listeners know this, but I just love the fact that originally it was the Secretary of War. Like, they were honest about what that was, and now it's the Secretary of Defense. And that was back when they actually were defensive wars, largely speaking, so it's completely Orwellian.
And it was the War Department. The War Department instead of the Department of Defense. So it's the same point you're making,
Okay, so you had a lot of great stuff there. Let's see. So it struck me when you said how they were linking it and saying, you know what, it's no longer enough just to go in and win on the battlefield and have a military victory. We also need to follow up with diplomacy and development, and those things are all linked. It sounds so analogous to like a progressive leftist domestically saying, it's not enough just to have, food stamps and stuff, but we got to have pre-K education, because otherwise, we're setting these families up for a cycle of, failure. Like, in other words, like, there's no area of life, like, they need to just keep taking over more and more and trust us. You just give us this and then everything will be great. And it seems like it's the same thing on what like neoconservatives.
Yep. And no, you're exactly right. It is literally planning almost the entirety of life in the name of addressing the root cause of the perceived problem. And it's all under the guise of liberalism, of creating freedom. So it's kind of like one of the memes that goes around where the U.S. soldier's kicking in the door and says, "I'm here to bring you freedom," or "I'm here to bring you democracy or markets," or whatever the phrasing is in the specific meme. But there is this irony there of employing the most illiberal means you can imagine, because it's also not like when you go into a combat situation, things go smoothly. Going back to our conversation about the war on drugs, it's not like you go into someone's country, you kick in their front door, you tell them what to do, and they're like, okay. It's not like they're pieces on a chessboard, to kind of invoke an analogy that Adam Smith used when he was talking about the man of the system. They're going to respond, and oftentimes violently. And it's the whole framing of it's very odd, because if you listen to American politicians, they'll say things like, and we talk about, I've talked about this in other articles and books, and this is bipartisan. Obama said this, Bush said this. They'll say things like, we gave Afghan citizens or Iraqi citizens the chance to be free. Like, it's a gift bestowed upon them that they have rejected. It never occurs to them that, going into someone else's country, sticking kind of a gun in their face, either figuratively or literally, may not be met and perceived as a gift. And so, the whole kind of rhetoric around all this is very ironic and problematic, I think.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was The Onion. I don't think it was Babylon. I think it was The Onion, like years ago, and they had a thing where the headline was, Iraqi man says his brother would have loved democracy had he not been killed in a drone strike, or something like that.
Exactly. Right. And like a lot of those articles, it's supposed to be fictional, but it's actually true, or captures an element of truth.
Right. So I guess we could grapple with it, because it is a big issue, and you're right, this sort of contradiction of people who's, all right, I'll back up. So Butler Schaefer, I don't know if you know him, but he wrote a book one time and I reviewed it. I'll get the link. So again, this is bobmurphyshow.com/155. I'll dig up my review of Butler's book on this. But it was talking about World War I, and just as you say, Chris, that the progressives, like, who were pointing to the War Industries Board and how they had nationalized all these industries temporarily for the war effort. And then the progressives were understandably saying, well, wait a minute, if when there's, when we have to go fight the Germans, that it makes sense to nationalize industry because, we can't leave things to the profit and loss mechanism and wasteful competition when there's a war at stake here. Well, our domestic things like hunger and poverty and illiteracy and whatever else, were the concerns of the day, those are important too. And so why wouldn't we plan for that? If planning works for these other goals, why wouldn't it work here too? And so I guess is I don't know if you get into this in the book, but so that's why for me, I try to the extent that I dabble in this stuff with the economics of war, and to point out, Mises makes these arguments a lot that no, actually you by nationalizing industries or having, quota systems and ration cards and whatever, that doesn't make you more nimble as a war machine. Like what the government needs, just raise through taxation or borrowing and go buy it in the open market and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? So that Mises makes that point a lot, that the most capitalist countries win their wars because they're capitalist. And to the extent that they deviate from it, that's not a necessary thing, that they shouldn't do that. Like you don't need a draft, that kind of stuff.
Yep. And so I don't deal with that directly. I mean, it's an interesting point. And that passage or passages in Human Action, Mises talks about that and elsewhere. It's always struck me as interesting because, but before I answer that, another great article on the progressive point, in addition to the Schaefer book that you're pointing out, Murray Rothbard has a wonderful article. I think it's the late 80s in the Journal of Libertarian Studies. It's called World War I is Fulfillment. Yeah. And he talks about how the World War I, you could make the argument for World War II too as well, but kind of, as you were pointing out, I think correctly, really was kind of the, as he calls it, the fulfillment of the progressive vision, and how they wanted to kind of take that then and let's just extend this to all walks of life. It works so well here. Why stop there? Let's have shoes, education, healthcare, food. It's a simple extension of the logic. But going back to, the Mises point about buying on the open market. I think that one area where Mises, perhaps what he overlooks in that argument, and again, this is an empirical issue. I'm not sure, I'm not making a claim of certainty here, but something to think about, is that it is true, I think, that private markets certainly would produce things more efficiently and effectively than socializing them. But of course, the minute government starts getting involved in purchasing military equipment from the private sector, it creates this network, what people call the military-industrial complex, right. the military-industrial congressional complex, which was the original name of it, which you could argue at least potentially has the effect of undermining the dynamism of markets, both in the immediate term and perhaps the long term. I don't know. Again, it depends on other factors as well. But there's that aspect as well to think about. In addition to these distortionary effects I was talking about, if you're a producer and you know that government is going to buy products for war, because typically government grants itself a monopoly on purchasing those products, or at least certain products. Some have dual use, civilian use and military use. You're going to shift your efforts to producing that, to lobbying government for not just to get into wars, even though that as well, but to constantly prepare for war. And that has distortionary effects on entrepreneurship, on the market process, on the capital structure, and so on. And those things are often unseen and unobserved and neglected. And again, you know this full well. You've argued with many macroeconomists in your life who hold this position that a dollar is a dollar. A dollar on a tank is a dollar invested by Bob Murphy in a private business. It's like, no, actually, they're not. They're very different things when you appreciate the structure of capital, the structure of production and entrepreneurship and so on. And so I think those are also important points that you can pull from kind of a number of Austrian thinkers to think about war production.
Right. And so the classic illustration of that insight is Bob Higgs's work to show why the standard real GDP figures for the 1940s that ostensibly show, look, they ran huge deficits and we got out of the Great Depression, and to show that if you break it down into private versus government GDP, then you see private consumption and investment were even lower in 1943 than they had been in 1933, that kind of stuff. So that's because, let me just clarify. So I'm an anarcho-capitalist. So of course I agree it would be better. So, but the point being, for example, to say, do we need price controls during the war? Because we got to prevent profiteering. And we got to have ration cards on using rubber because we need rubber for the war effort, or for steel. we can't just have it going to the highest bidder because they're needed for tanks. Yep. So just saying, to me, like that doesn't make, like, in other words, I think even a lot of believers in the free market in peacetime would agree that, oh yeah, during the World War, of course they had to nationalize industries because we're fighting the Nazis, and that trumps everything. And to point out, well, no, even on your own terms, if to the extent that you're going to have a government in charge of running the military, those things actually cripple the economic response.
Yep. So those compound. You're exactly right. Rationing, price controls, nationalization, all these things are highly distortionary.
Right,
so,
or like an excess profits tax or a windfall profits tax and stuff that just hampers the like, because Mises has some great stuff, folks, and I'll link to, because I had an article on this about the economics of war and Mises, where I'm not going to do it justice, but saying things like, when the war breaks out, like, what needs to happen is entrepreneurs need to convert factories that have been making cars, need to start cranking out tanks.
Right.
And so in general, if conditions change and you need entrepreneurs to see that, and you don't have an excess profits tax, that's the last thing in the world you want to do.
That's
you
right. That's right.
Let's see. So I guess, do you get into, well, how much of it is the conventional, like the cynical view being that these wars are all driven by like the defense company, and Scott Horton has a great point saying, like, when you see ads for like Boeing and Raytheon and stuff like on major media, it's not because someone in the audience who watches CNN is thinking about buying an F-16. It's like, why do they ever? And his theory was that's the way these alleged defense contractors funnel money to major media, just to make sure that they're treated sympathetically. And what you get what I'm saying? So like,
yeah.
And it really is amazing. Like, even as much as the media hates Trump's guts and he's Hitler, if he launches cruise missiles against somebody, it's like Trump actually acting presidentially. It's amazing. Like, as long as he's killing people, then all of a sudden they actually respect him.
Yep. And remember, of course, he was knocked. So originally when Trump took over, people were like, this guy's crazy, he's going to start World War III. Then he actually engages in diplomacy. And, this guy's crazy, he's meeting with these horrible leaders.
Right.
So you can't, like, which one is it? Like, and then, he should have attacked this person or that person. Well, if he's a lunatic, you don't want him having nuclear weapons, but we need him to have those because anyway, it's a hot mess. But, I don't think that all wars are undertaken for profiteering by private interests. And, I in saying that, I want to make sure I'm clear. It's not that I don't think private firms influence public policy and foreign policy. They certainly do. And if you just look throughout history, much of, and this is one of the critiques of capitalism from Marxists, of course. And John Hobson had a book called Imperialism. I think it's like 1902, where he made the argument, and he influenced Lenin. And when Lenin talked about this, how capitalists, part of the capitalist system is constantly expanding your markets and looking for kind of new markets to sell your wares, but also to exploit resources as you exploit all your resources domestically. And so a natural part of capitalism for them is war making. And I certainly don't think that either. I don't think war making and capitalism go hand in hand. In fact, I view them as being as significantly opposed to one another. So I don't want to say that those interest groups don't have any influence, but I also, like most things, they don't have monocausal, meaning they're not the single factor driving all wars. There's lots of things. There's geopolitics. There's the interests of politicians, which can be tied to Halliburton or prop firms, but to lots of other things too. And some of those can be, I also think that we shouldn't dismiss that. I think politicians oftentimes believe that they're doing good. They think that by intervening around the world and controlling things and shaping things, that they're somehow doing good. We can disagree on that, by the way, but we also can't rule it out.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think, going back to Scott Horton's point, I'm a huge fan of his work in general, that these advertisements are part of what I would consider, or what Abby and I talk about our next book, which is coming out in probably 9 months, called Manufacturing Militarism, play on Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent, how the U.S. government and combined with the military-industrial complex engages in constant propaganda. And part of that is to normalize militarism. So part of the way you can see this is these advertisements, just like you can see, the military somehow playing an active role in U.S. sporting events, is to normalize the military, to normalize those. This is just a normal part of life, and to question those things makes you crazy. You're either unpatriotic or you're apologist for whatever foreign country or government you want to put there, or you don't want people to be safe. You want soldiers to die, or you want innocent people to die. And so, at least in the American system, from a young age, you are taught that the military is literally indispensable. And you walk through an airport and you see members of the military, and what happens? People often applaud for them. They thank them. They buy them meals. And I've had friends who are in the military, but they don't have combat roles. They're like in a back office job, and they're like, it's very weird when I'm walking through the airport, or sitting in a restaurant and someone buys my meal. I want to be like, hey, I'm just filling out papers. Or I had a former student who was a JAG, so a lawyer, and he's like, I've never been in combat. I'll never be in combat. I'm a lawyer. And so it's weird that people do this, but that's what's ingrained in your head. And if you look at opinion polls throughout time, the military, trust in the military in America is extremely high. Trust in Congress, trust in the executive branch varies, and oftentimes is quite low. I don't know who they think is controlling the military, but so there's that aspect of this to combat as well. And I think the onus on us, and I say us, being people like yourself who think about these issues, alternatives to the state, not necessarily just like let's put another rule in place to constrain the state, but can we envision a world that doesn't require the state to perform a certain service? A topic I'm interested in as well. The onus is on us to both think about those things conceptually and empirically, very much like you do in your book on chaos theory, right? It's like a mix of empirics, of theory, and you're trying to think through these really hard issues. And I think that's an open research program, an area of interest. It's not a closed set of conclusions, but rather something we need to think about really hard and invest time and effort in thinking about academically in a scholarly way.
Let's be a little bit fanciful now. So you mentioned stuff. Living in the U.S. the last few years, I have finally, I totally understand now, the stereotypical thing, like in a South American country where the civil government is just completely corrupt and not working, and the generals take over, and why a large portion of the public supports that. That never made sense to me before. But what's wrong with those people? Now I totally get it. I could totally see in the U.S. in the not so distant future where it's just so dysfunctional. Let's say this upcoming election, it's close. They're still arguing over mail-in ballots a week later. 30% of the country genuinely believes Trump's the president. Another 30% genuinely believes Biden's the president, and they're willing to go to civil war over it. And you could see the military finally just stepping in and be like, okay, we're taking charge, and we're going to be an interim thing. And you can imagine a lot of people think, oh, thank God. Let's have some tanks in the streets to stop the looting and the rioting and da-da-da. Whereas I wouldn't have thought it could happen here that quickly if you'd asked me 5 years ago. And so I'm just wondering, given all that, you're studying and you're looking at other countries, and how much do you think Americans don't realize how far things have gone here?
I'm not going to make any predictions about November. The Atlantic, I think, had an article, it was very recent, about kind of these different scenarios. Some of them were peaceful transfers.
I want you to tell us which quarter does the Civil War start?
But certainly, the people have to realize that the U.S. government, irrespective of what we're talking about, the current president, the future president, or the last several administrations, the U.S. government has one of, if not the most powerful surveillance apparatus in the history of mankind. I say one of because you might make an argument that China, the Chinese government's current surveillance apparatus is either equal to or superior. I don't know how you would measure those things, but the U.S. government has access to literally everyone's information, and they've had access to it for, again, to varying degrees depending on the technology for decades. Again, people will say, the normal thing is I have nothing to hide, so that's okay. But to my way of thinking, And Abigail Hall and I talk about this in the conclusion of our book, Tyranny Comes Home. We call it how do you get out of this ever? It's really hard to get out of it. Government's not going to constrain itself, because asking the people who wield power to constrain that power, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so ultimately the burden falls on the citizenry, and they need to hold what we call an anti-militaristic mentality. And that it puts a strong burden on people. They have to care about freedom. They have to understand the nature of government and kind of the paradox of government. You give government a lot of guns to protect you. They might protect you, but they also might point those guns at you. And so how do you resolve that dilemma? These issues that we've been talking about how kind of special interest groups can manipulate government policy and the allocation of resources for their own narrow interest. But it also requires a healthy skepticism about claims by government about the need for the military apparatus, and an understanding of government not just as a source of protection, what you and I were talking about in terms of defense and offense before, but as a threat too. And it's not just a threat against other people, but a threat against citizens. And so any power you give to government to protect you also creates a threat against you. And so, if the wrong person, whoever that was, got to be in charge, and the conditions existed that granted them a significant amount of discretionary power, because there are checks and balances. There are people that check behavior. It's not like Donald Trump can do anything he wants at any point in time. He can do a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. Then certainly the U.S. government could literally take over domestic life right now. They have control of the banking system, surveillance, the ability to kill people very easily. Through the military technology that we were talking about earlier, and so on. And so people have to be aware of that. This is not, and again, I'm not like sounding the alarm like tomorrow the world's going to end, but that exists. And we talk about this at the end of the book. David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, who's been known for many things, but one of the things he's known for is what's called Hume's political maxim. And what Hume said is, when we're thinking about political rules, imagine that the knave is in charge. And what he meant as the knave was kind of think about, it can be either a person, like choose the real world politician that you either despise right now the most or historically have despised, or it can be some kind of ideal type. Think about the least desirable politician you can think of, the characteristic, and imagine that person running whatever program or policy or controlling the surveillance apparatus. Would you want them to have it? If not, that should give you pause.
Right.
Because the standard way people think about things, kind of as you were talking about earlier, I think correctly, is that people kind of suffer from presentism. And if my person is in charge, I'm okay with it. But if the other person is in charge, then somehow we're going to hell in a handbasket. But that doesn't solve the fundamental kind of problem, which is it's the power that you've given to the person in that position that's the problem. And so, one way to think about this is, a lot of people are like, let's constrain it. Another way is, let's get rid of it. Let's not have so much power concentrated in the hands of a single person. And you see that right now. I mean, think about in America, irrespective of where the viewers stand ideologically. Think about how much power is really associated with two positions right now: a Supreme Court justice and the President of the United States, such that depending on a choice between people, it can have radically different outcomes that can affect literally hundreds of millions of people. To my way of thinking, something is severely amiss with that kind of system. And it's not something like we need a couple more rules written down to constrain people. It's that, maybe that kind of power shouldn't be concentrated in that centralized form.
Yeah, exactly. I still wish, though, that you would pick the quarter in which the Civil War begins. All joking aside, though, I mean, so not pinning you down that hard, but I mean, do you, and I know no matter what you say is going to end up being wrong, so you don't want to be too specific, but in terms of you studying this stuff and having books on it and Tyranny coming home, I'm just wondering how pessimistic are you about like the next 5 years?
Sure. So I'm optimistic overall, because I think, given my worldview, which requires, like you, I very much think in terms of anarcho-capitalism. And so that worldview, I think, is inherently optimistic about the future, about human beings. It might be pessimistic about aspects, if not the entirety of the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not. I like to think that there's not going to be a civil war.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think that even if, under the worst case scenario, like you're talking about, where there's splits, there's there are disagreement about the the Supreme Court nomination or nominee, whoever that is. That this is extended out months due to absentee ballots. There'll be protests, there'll be violence, no doubt. Do I think the country's going to erupt into an outright civil war across the country? No. If you force me to pick,
mm-hmm.
Again, I could very well be wrong. I don't. The interesting thing about civil wars and revolutions is no one can predict them, or usually they'd be squashed in the first place. And so, and the other reason why I think is that the minute real violence came into play, I think the federal government would get involved. I do. I think and we saw hints of this already, like in Portland, the law and order type response.
Right.
So again, now if everyone started revolting, there wouldn't be enough military force to squash them all. Not unless you dropped some kind of nuclear weapon on them. So that's why I'm kind of optimistic about there not being an outright civil war. So over the next 5 years, look, I believe, very much in line with what Mises argued in liberalism and what Hayek argued in Constitution of Liberty, that human civilization is fundamentally the result of human creativity, that as long as humans are given enough space to exercise that creativity, that things will continue to get better. Or what the economist Julian Simon called the ultimate resource, human creativity, the human mind. I think that when the state does pretty much everything it does, it squashes part of human creativity. But I still think, there's a lot of margins of human freedom. And so I'm optimistic because I think that as long as those margins are allowed to persist, I think, and I hope, might be a hope more than thinking, kind of the Julian Simon or Mises Hayek racehorse of innovation, of improvements in human welfare will continue to beat the state horse that's trying to hold that back.
Right. Well, what I'm taking away from this discussion is that when the new Republic of Texas breaks away from the Biden administration, they're going to send in defense diplomacy and development after they drop the small scale, the tactical nukes, just on areas outside of Houston. Okay, why don't we wrap up with, I know you're the co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics and the Independent Review. So can you just to speak a little bit, like how do you do, like, did you do Gandhi's thing about be the editor you want to see in the world? Like you just said, hey, I want these journals to go in a certain direction, and you do, or is it more just you evaluate each article on its merits, or how does that work? I've never been an editor of a journal, so I don't know like what the philosophy is, or how do you approach that task? Sure,
that's a wonderful question. I don't, again, I've been doing this now for a while in both journals. And I think it varies, and by journal to journal, I mean. And, first of all, I'm honored to be involved in both journals. I mean, the Review of Austrian Economics, Murray Rothbard was involved in it originally, founding of it is what I mean. And then since then, Joe Salerno has been involved, Walter Block's been involved. I think Pete Boettke took over the Review of Austrian Economics, I think in 1999. And so when I came into graduate school in the early 2000s, I started working with him kind of as like the managing editor. And so I wasn't involved in evaluating papers or anything like that. It was like processing. But I learned kind of the backroom operations of how a journal works. And then I continued to be involved in that after I graduated and entered academics. I was the North American editor for several years and then became co-editor in 2013. And that's also when I became co-editor of the Independent Review. The Independent Review was founded in 1996 by Bob Higgs and David Thoreau. And the emphasis there is kind of on classical liberal or political economy with a classical liberal kind of bent to it. And so it's a different focus than the RE, although there's some overlap, of course. And so, at the RE, of course, there's different views on editing. And early on, long ago, when journals start, I'm talking decades ago, editors would basically edit. They would get a paper. They would oftentimes make a decision themselves. They'd write what we would call referee reports today. Oftentimes they'd kind of line by line edit the paper. And it was a much more personal process. Now what's kind of happened, and I don't know, you write academic articles as well, so you can push back on this if you want. But I think a lot more what's happened is that editors kind of are almost like facilitators, where they get a paper, they either desk reject it, so send it back and say, we're not going to send this out, or they send it out. The referees say something, and they just say, the referee said accept, revise, and resubmit, or reject, and then they just say that to the author. And I tried to strike a middle ground with the RE, Pete and I do. Whereas we'll get papers, and the way I think about it is, does this paper contribute to our understanding of Austrian economics, either historically or how we do Austrian economics now? Mm-hmm. And so, and does it meet academic standards in a broad sense? And so from that standpoint, we're kind of gatekeepers. We filter, because we also don't want to waste people's time if we're not going to publish the paper, either the author's time or so I try to have a quick turnaround with that. We try to find qualified referees, so anonymous reviewers, to review it. And I always use those as a guide rather than as a final decision maker. And so usually I align with the referees. If a referee, especially, and of course, I should thank you because you've helped us numerous times with papers.
Or have I? We don't know.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But, if someone if it's an area where it's outside an area where I have a ton of specialization, I oftentimes rely on the referees to provide insight to that aspect. But I'll still use it as a guide. Sometimes we'll go to get another opinion if it's kind of a split decision. Sometimes we go against referee decisions. They'll say reject, but I'll say, look, I think this paper has potential, so why don't you revise it? Independent review is slightly different. There's three of us. I co-edit the journal with Mike Munger and Robert Waples. We're equal co-editors. And there it's much more, Pete and I are in constant contact with the RE. But with the independent review, it's much more run as a group, where each paper we discuss, we decide if we're going to send it out, we identify referees, we get those reports, and then we discuss them as a group and make a decision. And we try to reach consensus as much as we can on each paper. And so in each case, you're a gatekeeper. You can't help but have some vision of what the journal should look like. That's, no matter who's running a journal, you have some vision of what's counts as fitting with the journal and what doesn't count. And we just try our best to select the highest quality papers that fit. In the independent review, we also do a lot of special issues. We do some with the review of Austrian economics. We do a lot of special issues around themes. So I've done them on foreign policy before, on kind of different views in classical liberalism on foreign policy. Right now, I'm doing one on public health in a free society. So how would a free society handle issues of public health? And it's kind of motivated by the COVID pandemic.
Well, yes, that's a good example of what I mean, where you're not passively just sitting back and saying, well, whatever people send will, like you might decide, no, I think this is a hot thing. We should have an issue devoted to this thing. Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. And then we do, with certain kind of key events in Austrian economics. So a couple of years ago, we did one. It was the anniversary of Mises's Nation, State, and Economy. And so we did an issue around that. So it's a mix. And of course, it's open. So people can submit papers whenever they want and, on whatever topic they think fits with the journal as well. And so it's a mix of those.
All right, last thing, I want to get your feedback on, or your opinion. Are you familiar with what was called the grievance studies hoax?
Is this
it was like Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, and they did this stuff like the rapes in the dog park and stuff like that, and
then it got through the journal process,
right? So they got a bunch of stuff published in like these critical studies journals, but they of course didn't believe it. Like the point was to show, look at the weakness of these disciplines. So when that happened, of course, so I don't know if you know, but like a lot of the stuff is hilarious. Like in one of them, they took passages from Mein Kampf and just changed it to be like, women empowerment and put it in that way, and it got through and stuff like that. So, but I was really thinking it through and wondering, like, what does that mean? And like, would we be vulnerable to something like that? And so my take was, no, I can honestly say like the stuff that I'm not an editor, but as a referee, like if it turned out that, I was the referee on a paper that made some point about libertarian political philosophy, like the implications of the non-aggression principle, or the one I picked was like, suppose someone made a case for, the private market delivery of suitcase nukes and what would it look like in a free society. And you can imagine someone getting that through and getting published in the Journal of Libertarian Studies or whatever. Yep. And then the author coming, surprise, I'm a normal person. Look at these crazy nut jobs. I got an article published. But like if it had made contribute, I would say, no, that was good. Like they couldn't just say socialism bad, free markets yay. We wouldn't have published that. Like it would have to be a genuine contribution, and it'd have to cite the literature. And you know, if they didn't deal with the obvious objections, we would say as a referee, well, no. I mean, a normal person reading this is going to think, wouldn't warlords use this? So you got to deal with, you know what I'm saying? So my point, and the ultimate one I took was like a math journal. If someone got something published in a math journal, it wouldn't matter whether the person believes it or not. You'd say, no, this followed the rules and blah, blah, blah. So short of if they, you know, in one of the cases, they just falsified data, like with the dog park one. And so there I can say, yeah, using a referee, you're going to trust they're not just making up numbers or something. And so there, but in terms of like the intent of the person, I thought, no, like the way we run our stuff, that we're not vulnerable to that. Like that wouldn't be embarrassing. I said, okay, if you don't believe it, fine, but it was a good contribution.
Right, exactly. And so, you know, in general, I'm not a huge fan of kind of gotcha things like that in general. And this has become like a thing. And I don't like it from either side, by the way. I don't like I caught you doing gotcha. And I don't like it in that form. I don't like it in the form of another kind of common form now is kind of in intellectual history, where you look back at someone and you kind of attack them as a person and you say, well, this person, you know, said this at this time, they're a racist. So therefore you dismiss everything they say.
Right.
And, you know, it's not to say a person's person makeup doesn't matter for certain areas of study. If you want to learn about a person, certainly you want to know about them. But I think it's a very cheap, poor form of scholarship. Now, you know, I would like to think that, you know, as journal editors, we always keep out the bad stuff and the made up stuff. And I agree with you overall. Look, I think that someone could submit something and they have a paragraph or like a footnote that says something goofy and it would get through. And then they could say, see, Chris Coyne's a goof. He let a goofy thing through. And it's like, yeah, you know, I didn't sit there and read every single line carefully, and I should have. Just like you point out, you know, for an empirical paper with data, that, you know, we end up trusting the author. We don't, even when we look at certain things, we'll say like, you know, can we see kind of, you know, the kind of overview of your statistics, right? And so we can look at certain aspects of it. We don't say like, I'm going to go replicate the data and the exact test to see what you did. And if you did that, very little would get done.
Right.
That's an argument to my way of thinking to open up journals to replication studies, which are not, as you know, not very popular in most journals because they don't say anything new necessarily. But, you know, I don't think about this too much just because, like you, I'm like, I hope that we evaluate papers carefully enough to like, if they make an argument, I don't care what the person believes, as you pointed out. Is it a good argument or a bad argument? I don't care if it's crazy by someone's standards. Is it good? Is it a good argument given the scope of the journal? If it is, then let's go with it and have that discussion. And then people can argue back if they want to. But again, you know, the whole movement towards like, I got you, I recorded you saying, so it's like the thing where people, you know, if any of us recorded what we said and then took certain things out of context, we would all sound like nuts, crazy people.
Right.
That's any human being. And so it's so that's why I kind of, when people on the right, I remember as I was going around, were so excited about that. I don't think it somehow attacked the discipline. You know, I don't think it undermined the discipline, even if I don't like what the people in that discipline do. And I don't have a strong opinion on it.
Well, on that, so where I ended up concluding, just I don't want to mislead the listeners, and I did an episode on this, so I'll link to that. But I was just trying to refine, like, what exactly is the lesson from that? Because I agreed there was something there, and what I think, and some people agreed with me after, is that the ease with which these three people just walked into these fields and published apparently in some of their top journals. Whereas, like, if you thought quantum physics was goofy, like, oh, it can be a particle in a wave. Right. You couldn't just walk in and read a bunch of quantum physics articles and 3 months later and then go get published in the top journal and pretend to be, you know what I mean? Like you wouldn't be able to fake it. And the same thing here. Like I'm in other words, so I think like certainly Austrian Economics and, you know, for the RAE or the QJE, someone couldn't just go in and have read a little bit of Mises and then bluffed and fooled us. Like we'd say, no, well, did you read this article? No, he says this. And then there's critic, you know what I mean? Like, you couldn't just walk. So I think part of what they showed was just the lack of rigor in these fields.
Yeah, right. I understand. And there was an earlier hoax in the 90s. I think it's called the Sokol, right? Isn't that it? The Sokol affair, Sokol hoax, he was a physicist, I think, who did it. I think it was in cultural studies again. In any case, I agree with you. Certainly some fields are easier to do it in than others. And it also might mean, by the way, we have to keep open that there's something wrong with those fields if that can happen. So I don't want to exclude that either.
Right.
I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about. It certainly made me think as a journal editor, much along the lines of what you were thinking about. Like, could I fall prey to this?
Right.
So from that standpoint, it's a useful thought exercise in itself, I think.
Mm-hmm. And last thing I'll say, what I do try to do if I am refereeing a paper that has empirical stuff, I will do a kind of an idiot test, like just to go and look and see, is there anything jumping out that, no, that can't, that regression coefficient can't be right, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And I might even go Google a few things just to spot check it, just to see, do I catch them, but yeah, you're like you said, you're not going to go reproduce the whole thing. You might if I was a referee for like a medical journal or something, I probably might, if people's lives are at stake, but it's economics. No one's going to read this stuff anyway. So. If we're talking about the structure of Ancapistan, when they get down to that, they'll say, Murphy, why didn't you vet this better? This guy made up these numbers. Right. Okay, well, that's probably a good spot to wrap up. So, folks, the URL for all this stuff is bobmurphyshow.com/155. My guest has been Chris Coyne. Chris, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. Take care.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.